Welcome to episode 2 of Reclining at Table with Jesus. In the next 8 episodes, I would like us to consider what the Bible has to say on the topic of suffering. My morning devotionals and my recent readings have been talking about the Christian going through suffering. I'm also reading through this book, which is by a man called John Newton. He wrote Amazing Grace Hymn, and he was also a pastor for many years. And this book is a compilation of his letters to other people. And on page 383, in the last paragraph, he came up with this phrase as he was talking to a friend about suffering. And he called suffering the bitter tree that by God's grace produces good fruit. So suffering is a bitter tree that by God's grace produces good fruit. So I've been considering for a while the biblical understanding of suffering. And as we sit at table with Jesus, I just ask you to come and listen to Jesus and see what he has to say to us about suffering. Maybe I'm talking to you now and you find yourself going through a difficulty and a dark season. And I pray the next few episodes will really help you and may be some medicine to your wound. So if you've got a Bible, please turn with me to Hebrews chapter 12. In chapter 11, we've got the great host of witnesses, all the saints of the past who were mistreated and suffered. And you see them in verse 35, some of the things that happened to them. It says that some were tortured and refused to accept release. Verse 36, others suffered mocking and flogging, even chains and imprisonment. They were stoned, some were sawn in two, some were killed with a sword. Some went about in sheepskins and goatskins, destitute, afflicted, and mistreated, of whom the world was not worthy. Some lived in dens and caves and went out into the desert. But after this great host of witness, this cloud of witnesses, he turns to Jesus as the example in chapter 12, verse 3, and shows us that even the Son of God suffered. And it says, consider Jesus, who endured from sinners such hostility against himself, so that you may not grow weary or faint-hearted. So all the saints in the past suffered. Jesus, the Son of God, suffered. Actually, they would call him in Isaiah 53:3, the man of sorrows and acquainted with griefs. And then it comes to us. And if Jesus suffered, and if those of the Old Testament saints suffered, then we will also face dark days ahead. So don't consider it a strange thing, Peter says, when you go through difficulties and suffering. And come with me and listen to Jesus and see if he's got something to say to you that will help you on suffering. So in chapter 12 of Hebrews, verse 11, the thing I want to talk about today when we come to suffering, and the first thing I want us to hear in verse 11 is that all suffering is painful and it is not pleasant. John Newton called it the bitter tree, and it is bitter. So if I find you at this moment, if you are listening and you're going through a dark period, let's not pretend that it's pleasant. It is not pleasant. It is a turmoil of the soul. Adam and Eve, back in chapter 3 of Genesis, after God created them, they disobeyed God. They ate from the tree. God said to Eve that pain would come to her in childbirth in verse 16. To Adam in verse 17, pain would come to him from the produce of his work from the ground. It's painful. David would say in Psalm 42, "O my soul, why are you downcast? Hope in God." He says it a number of times, especially in verse 11. Paul tells us in Acts 14, verse 22, as he was finishing his first missionary journey before he went back to Antioch, he wanted to strengthen the church, and he talked to them about suffering, because a saint must understand suffering. And that's one of the first lessons the Apostle Paul taught these new churches, is that they must enter the kingdom of heaven through much tribulation. He would say to Timothy in 2 Timothy chapter 3, verse 12, if anybody desires a godly life, they're going to face suffering and persecution. So please don't see it as a strange thing. We live in a broken world with many enemies and even Satan. The saint is going to face suffering, and it is not pleasant. It is painful. Like Jeremiah, the weeping prophet, or even Job, you may curse the day that you were born. And you may say, like Jesus, I've just been acquainted with grief from my birth until my burial. And I want you to come and consider Jesus. He is the one in Psalm 56 who bottles up our tears. And in Matthew 5 verse 4, he says, blessed are those that mourn, for they shall be comforted. Revelation 21:4 says, he will wipe away every tear. So if I find you at this moment and you have tears because of the suffering, because of the pain, and it's not pleasant, come to Jesus at table. Consider him, see his wounds for you in his hands and his feet and his sides, and let him serve you with gentleness and kindness. Consider him, and he will bottle your tears, he will comfort you, and he will wipe away your tears. But let's not pretend. Suffering is real. It is not pleasant. It is painful. And in the coming episodes, I pray I would bring something to the table from the Bible that will be helpful to you. But until then, consider Jesus, chapter 12 of Hebrews, verse 3. And I pray that you will not grow weary or faint-hearted. May God bless you today.